let's make a start for the 2023-24 RECCo budget webinar this morning. So I hope everyone is in the right place, and we'll just run through what you can expect to hear from us all this morning, and hopefully give you a really good overview of everything that we've been up to, as well as a strong focus on the planned budget for 23-24, which, as you know, is currently open for REC parties to provide their feedback and comment on. So a quick run through the agenda this morning. Obviously, there's a welcome that I'm doing at the moment, and we'll have some introductions shortly. We'll then have a section looking through the strategy and forward work plan, followed by the REC services, an overview of the programmes that we're proposing to undertake, followed by the main focus of this morning's webinar, which is on the 23-24 budget, followed by an opportunity at the end for everybody to ask their questions, and I'll go on to explain about how that's going to work in a minute. So that's me. I'm Jonathan Ainley. I'm the Interim Director of Stakeholder Engagement and Communications here at RECCo, and I'm the facilitator for this morning's webinar. Just a few points to be aware of. Everyone's camera and microphone will be automatically switched off and muted just to help us run this morning's event a bit more smoothly. Please do use the Q&A or chat function to ask any questions as they occur to you throughout this morning during the presentations. Those will be logged by ourselves, and then at the Q&A at the end we will sweep up all of those questions and pose them to the relevant presenter. So please, as they occur, please do just post them in the Q&A and chat functions, and we will take care of things from there. And finally, just to be aware, the meeting is being recorded, and following this morning it will be made available on our website and circulated. So if you're not comfortable with attending a meeting that is being recorded and will be made available, please do obviously leave the meeting at this point. Otherwise, we will deem it that you've consented to be part of the meeting that will be recorded and made available. So just to introduce this morning's speakers who you're going to hear from, first up you will hear from John Dixon, who's our Director of Strategy and Development. John's going to run you through the key themes from the forward work plan that has recently been published and the consultation period has concluded for, and the process that was followed, and what you can expect from us from this point forward in terms of what the forward work plan will look like to run from the 1st of April of this year. Then Elizabeth Lawler, who's our Director of Operations, will run you through our current services and also the evolution of those services and some thoughts on what that is going to look like. Following Elizabeth will be Pete Davis, our Director of Data Technology and Transformation. Pete's going to talk through the 5 key areas of transformation priorities that we have identified to take forward at RECCo. And Pete will be followed by Brian O'Shea, our Director of Finance and Commercial, who's going to give you a detailed overview of the proposals that are contained in our budget. We're going to run through all 4 presentations one after the other, followed by a Q&A at the end. So without further ado, I will hand over to John, who's going to talk through the strategy and forward work plan. So John, good morning.
Thanks, Jonathan. Morning, everybody. So as Jonathan set out, we have already published our strategy and forward work plan earlier in January with the accompanying forecasts of the cost to deliver that plan. We've also held a webinar on it, so I don't plan to go into great detail on that today. Just a brief recap on the key themes, as Jonathan said, which provides some context for the budget for the following year, which Brian will run through later. So if we can move on to the next slide, please. As we set out in the forward work plan, we're aiming to strike the right balance, because you recognise that constant change isn't necessarily helpful. So we want to make sure that there is the right balance between stability and making sure we are also facilitating incremental changes both to the services that we're providing and the arrangements that we govern. In part, Elizabeth will touch upon that later, but we also have a role in facilitating industry-wide programmes, not just those that are focused through retail energy codes such as switching, but things like market-wide half-hourly settlement, where there are more consequential impacts on retail arrangements. All of that work has been set out in that forward work plan, so it's a comprehensive overview of everything we do. And all of those activities really stem from our mission statement as set out by Ofgem and captured in the license and in the REC itself. And those have been set out in 5 real strategic themes. So first and foremost, REC was set up to be a consumer-centric code. So everything we do will have some trace back to consumer benefits. Make sure that those benefits are clearer and we can provide the breadcrumbs to show how we're delivering on those. But everything has that fundamental objective. A key means of delivering that benefit to consumers is obviously to have a more effective and efficient retail market. So we're working to facilitate competition, not just by, as I say, improving switching, etc., but by looking at other things we can do to improve the interoperability between parties and make sure that the services that we as an industry deliver to the consumer are as good as they can be. That also feeds into the costs of providing those services. So our focus is not just on making sure that RECCo as an organisation and the arrangements we deliver are efficient, but also trying to identify where there are pain points, if you like, that which contribute to the costs to serve. And if we can address those, then we can make our contribution to reducing the costs to the consumer. And I guess the more overarching context of all of this is, although the focus has been on affordability recently, we've committed as a nation to meeting 2030 targets for net zero, etc., and longer term trying to make sure the planet doesn't warm by more than 1.5 degrees, etc. So we shouldn't lose sight of our longer term ambitions to make contributions to facilitating net zero, and part of that must be making sure we take the consumer with us. It's not all done at the generation end of the supply chain, and we do that primarily by helping to catalyse and facilitate improvements. So this will be things like making sure our data is available, providing analysis and to the extent we can on those changes, and generally making sure there are no blockers on helpful innovations and beneficial change. So we tried to capture as much of that as we could in the forward work plan. We identified 5 key themes. Elizabeth will touch upon the ones that we're most directly in charge of, which is the improvements to the REC services. Obviously, Pete will touch upon the work we're doing to facilitate the market-wide half-hourly settlement programme and what we're doing to help facilitate that transition to that system. And also what we're doing to open up our data and making sure that we're thinking of how we capture consumer consents, etc. I will also be happy to touch upon what we're doing to help reduce the problems of energy theft. In the following year, we'll be taking forward a lot of the actions that we captured at our theft workshop in November. Part of which was to follow up on the publication of the theft estimation methodology report, which identified that there's up to £1.4 billion of energy currently being stolen in Great Britain. Obviously, if we can mitigate that, then that will be of direct benefit to the consumer, not just in terms of reducing their bills, but also making the situation much more safe, because each and every example of a meter tampered with is a dangerous situation. And finally, we've got a broad sweep of kind of policy initiatives, which is really us identifying what consequential impacts there will be on the retail arrangements arising from either Ofgem policies or government policy through the new energy security and net zero department, as we must now refer to it. We set out some of those that we are aware of in the forward work plans, such as the facilitation of regulation of heat networks, the transition to hydrogen in due course, potentially the regulation of third-party intermediaries, etc. But more immediately, there's obviously a focus on issues such as PPM installations and whether or not we're accurately capturing whether or not consumers should be treated as being vulnerable and not part of that forced installation, etc. We believe we can help facilitate that work and the activities of suppliers by an improved priority services register proposition. So we'll be issuing proposals on that before the end of this month and hopefully making the contribution to that. I think more generally, as we move from a kind of government subsidy of wholesale costs to something which may be more targeted upon consumer support, that kind of insight as to where we need to be providing that support will become ever more important. Just over this winter, we supported BEIS, as was in the provision of data to help them with the extension of the energy bill support scheme to make sure that it could reach consumers who were not ordinarily captured by that scheme. So we've just seen in the press this week that consumers on, caravan parks, holiday homes, etc., are finally receiving some support. And if we hadn't been able to provide some data to the base, it's not clear that would have happened. And I think as we move forward, it's likely that the data that we help provide to government will become ever more important than that. So I think that's all I was going to say on the overview. If we can move forward from there, please, John. So again, just to set out the timeline of this, today's event is part of an overall process. We have consulted on that forward work plan. I'll touch upon the feedback from that in a moment, but we're now at the stage where the budget has been signed off by the RECCo board, but the Retail Energy Code does provide opportunity to appeal this budget to Ofgem. That is on specific cost lines only, and Ofgem have previously indicated, I'm sure they would do again, that they'd much prefer that is engage with RECCo and try and resolve any issues before raising an appeal to them. But nonetheless, that ability to appeal, that right to appeal, is there. That will close on the 7th of March. Hopefully we won't receive any. If one is raised, then we can't prescribe what the Ofgem timeline to turn that around would be, but we would nonetheless publish the 23-24 budget and make provision for that appealed item, and just make sure there's absolute transparency as to what's happening. So hopefully that's clear in terms of the process and the next steps. If we move on to the next slide, please, John. As I say, we did host a webinar on the forward work plan earlier this year as well. We had a lot of attendance to that. We had 87 people join that, and we've subsequently had over 100 people download the forward work plan from our website. So a high level of engagement in this. And I think it's testament to the amount of transparency that was in there, and the fact that we'd signalled all of this work. And it's largely a continuation of what we'd initiated last year as well, that we received only one response to that, which was an endorsement of our approach to changes to switching, which was to progress them through the code's roadmap, i.e. make sure that they go through the change management arrangements as per any other change proposal. So that was a support of that. We've also received some questions subsequently on the budget, which we have responded to. Those questions will be fed into an FAQ along with any questions that we received today, to again make sure that all parties have access to that and we're being as transparent as possible. So I will hand you over from there to Elizabeth. Thank you.
Morning, everyone. Thank you. A fire alarm has literally just started in the background behind me. I don't know if you can hear that on the call. So just bear with me 30 seconds. Can someone in the RECCo team let me know if you can hear the fire alarm in the background?
I can't hear it.
You can't hear it. Okay, I will ignore it then. Good morning, everyone. It's nice to see so many people on the call today. I'm just sorry, I'm just checking to see if the building's being evacuated or not. I think I'm probably going to have to pause. Shall we swap order? Can Pete possibly do his section, please, whilst I see if I need to run out of a burning building? Is that okay? Thanks, Pete.
No problem. And hope you're okay, Elizabeth. Thank you, Jonathan. Okay, if we can go to the next slide, please. So as set out in the forward work plan, there's 5 focus areas with regards to our transformation. Firstly, some of you may have noticed that the project projections have reduced from the initial version accompanying the forward work plan released on the 13th of January. This reflects effectively a process of internal challenge where we went through each project, their provisional work packages, and scrutinised that in more detail. And that has allowed us to produce a budget that's more reflective of what needs to be done, and in this case, a lower budget. So that level of internal challenge has reduced the current provisions. And now I'll talk through each of those 5 areas. Keep in mind that there is no priority order. The 5 that are displayed here is as the order of the forward work plan, so it helps a reader should you have the forward work plan in front of you. So with regards to data and digitalisation, The scope that we have planned for next year is broader than historic plans and is principally broken down into a number of areas. First of all, initiatives around securing and opening up our data, improving the data quality, they remain similar to last year, but we haven't fully spent some of our budget of the current year, and some of those activities will fall into next year. And those are primarily focused, as John said in his intro, around net zero, consumer needs, and supporting innovation. We also recognise that we've implemented a number of new digital systems, particularly around EMAR and the RECCo portal. And from our recent stakeholder surveys, we know that this is an area that we need to improve. So a level of investment is included here to bring those up to the standards and quality that we want to achieve and you would expect. A third item which historically wasn't included in our thinking was some work around architectural aspects. RECCo has effectively collected a number of systems and providers, and we're conscious that that isn't necessarily the best user experience, having to log into multiple systems, go through multiple interaction points. And we are intending to review the architectural setup with the goal of improving the user experience, reducing the impact of any changes that should happen to systems, so that then has a reduced operational impact onto yourselves as RECCo parties. And that in turn will provide RECCo with the flexibility to make changes, but also to reduce costs in the mid to long term as a number of functions get effectively rationalized and reduced in repetition. There are two line items within the data and digitalization which are effectively binary. And what I mean by binary is the money won't be spent unless certain events happen. One of them is the Smart Secure Energy System. And that Smart Secure Energy System is following on from the government consultation last year. Should the government press ahead with those activities, then we have a provision of money to spend on that, particularly around understanding the impact of time of use tariffs and consumer consent activities. The second binary item is around consumer consent. So we're currently running a project to engage with consumer bodies, product manufacturers, RECCo parties on how is consent currently gathered? Should there be a basis for a tell me once principle for the consumer? And we're due to produce a paper in Q1, financial year Q1, so real year Q2, on the outcomes of that. And if the outcomes of that look like it's a goer for industry, that there is a case for changing consumer consent, then we will look to implement those. So those two items are effectively binary. Moving on to the second item, MHHS. The scope for MHHS is materially different from what we planned in the 2022-23 assumptions. This is particularly around the need for new data items and the provision of that data in a near real-time interface via the DIP. Historically, we had not considered that as an option for the future, but it now has become clear that is what's required. The second aspect is around qualification. Historically, we'd followed the assumption that it would follow similar planning and approach to CSS, where qualification was part of the overall programme. That's not the case within MHHS, and we're having to plan and budget for those activities. There are a number of other smaller items which I would recommend for those of you who've not watched the webinar for the budget that we produced in January. I recommend you watch that video and watch the section on MHHS provided by John Hawkins, who provides a much more deeper and detailed breakdown of activities. Moving on to the third item, theft. As John said in the intro, it's a fairly significant number, between 900 million and 1.4 billion cost to the consumer. The spend within theft is primarily a carryover from 22-23. This year, this financial year, we focused very much on defining the problem, and we now know what that is with the numbers I just mentioned. Moving into the new financial year, the initiatives around theft will be focused in 5 areas. One will be on establishing effectively stakeholder bodies to guide the work. The second one will be on the incentive schemes for theft detection. The third one will be on increasing awareness and for consumers and industry and how to handle theft. The fourth one will be on the creation of an industry-wide business case for the implementation of a data-driven theft detection service. Very conscious that trials didn't return, in terms of a business case, the value for money for industry. Technology has moved on, the industry has moved on, but that doesn't mean money should be spent without considering what the case would be. And that's what RECCo will focus on in the coming year to understand. And then the final fifth one is on the investigation into the establishment of a police unit to support prosecution. This follows similar initiatives in insurance and fraud, where you've got police units to support the detection and prosecution of those events. Moving on to the fourth one, I will skip over this one as Elizabeth will talk about it because it naturally flows on from services, and I understand that she's back in the game and everything's okay, so I will leave that to herself. The fifth one is on policy initiatives. John has covered principally the main direction of travel for that, so that's focused on prepayment, priority services register, third-party intermediaries, and the longer-term topics around heat. I will stop at this point, and hopefully, Elizabeth, you're back in the game.
Morning again. Sorry about that, everyone. Someone must have burnt the toast somewhere in the building, but I am here, so thank you. So John's taken you through the policy initiatives that his team will be focusing on. Pete kindly swizzed around and went through the transformation projects. So I wanted to spend my time this morning talking about the RECC services and what the operations team will be delivering within the proposed budget. And this essentially covers two elements. It's the business as usual delivery of existing requirements, and it's the evolution of those services for the future. So you'll recall from the Forward Work Plan webinar, if you were able to join that, and also the detail included in the budget document itself, that there are a broad range of RECC services that RECCo is required to deliver to support the functions and the obligations set out in the RECC. So these include the code manager services, central switching service, the energy inquiry services, the metering scheme auditor, the theft service providers, all of which are required to facilitate your operational business processes. Since the summer of last year, when RECC version 3 went live, the full suite of RECC services are now operational, and the scale and the complexity of those services is fully understood. So we've now got a clear picture of what we need to do from a capacity and a capability perspective to fulfill our obligations, to deliver those services, and to properly manage all of those service providers. And as I've spoken to you about previously, that service management layer that RECCo provides on behalf of industry is there to ensure that service providers meet their code and their contractual obligations and deliver a quality service to industry. We've got a performance assurance regime that's documented either in license or in code, in the case of the CSS, or in contract, for example, for our code manager service providers. And that's there to ensure that service providers are incentivized to deliver and are also accountable, including financially, if they don't. And I'm really pleased to say that over the last year, we've been building positive and constructive relationships with the providers of the RECC services as they've bedded into their new responsibilities and our ways of working. And across the piece, there's a consistent desire to deliver a high quality, user-friendly and responsive service. We recently conducted a customer satisfaction survey for some of those services. Thank you to all of those who participated. And I think the results of those show that we are on the right track with a combined overall satisfaction rating of 7.9 out of 10 for all of the service providers in scope. So this year, from an operations team perspective, we'll continue to work with those service providers and with parties to implement a programme of continuous improvement to address the areas of feedback and to build and strengthen on what we already have in place. If we can move on to the next slide. So the way that I see that in my mind is that's the kind of BAU plus, if you like, element of the operations team role. And then the second part is this proactive forward look, the evolution of the services. So as we set out before, we're committed to achieving that efficiency in the RECC services, ensuring that they're fit for purpose and able to meet the future needs of industry and the wider market. And we're committed to a competitive procurement process as often and as early as possible, where it's economic to do so. So we're always taking into account the different factors that come into play. As you'll have seen, set out for 23-24, we've allowed for 2 projects to establish the first stages of reprocurement for both the code manager services and the inquiry services. We've selected those 2 services due to their importance in terms of the effective industry operations, their requirements there, and also just naturally the timing of their expiry. So by conducting these reviews, it gives us that opportunity to ensure that we're maximising the use of the existing assets, but also to think more broadly about future industry requirements. We will engage with stakeholders and also the market to make sure that we identify the most competitive options available and to enable us to take advantages of advances in technical and service delivery capabilities. Both of these projects will be subject to formal project governance. They'll be delivered in accordance with our established procurement principles. And in both cases, a key part of our analysis of the available options will be to engage with our stakeholders to understand your views and priorities for those future services. So to summarise, all the RECCo services are now operational. Over the last few months, we've established a dedicated team of subject matter experts who are committed to embedding continuous improvement within the BAU delivery of those services. We've seen the benefits of the RECCo model and will continue to focus on quality service delivery. Alongside that business as usual work, we'll continue to look at the future service management and iterative changes that we need to make to those services to deliver for the future. I was going to hand over to Pete at this point, but we've swapped around, haven't we? So let me hand over to Brian instead, who's going to take you through the detailed numbers. Thanks very much.
Good morning, everyone. I had to change my script around. I now have to thank Elizabeth for handing over to me rather than thanking Pete for handing over to me. As you've heard, John has provided an update on the strategic plan for the coming year and the key areas that the organisation will be focusing on. The strategic plan covers 23-24, but also looks further out for the following 2 years. Pete set out the key RECCo transformation programmes for the coming year, and there was a focus on four areas, key themes, and they include data, theft, MHHS and RECC policy, and Elizabeth provided a lot of detail on the RECC services evolution. And now Elizabeth has just set out the RECC services and our role as the intelligent consumer, ensuring that we deliver those services and also evolve those services over time to meet the changing needs of the market. Over the following slides, we'll now discuss the resources required by RECCo for 23-24 as set out in our budget. Next slide, please. Thank you. So I give everyone a few seconds just to have a read of that. John earlier talked about the timescale associated with the consultation. I just want to pick up a little bit more around the consultation. Set out in the RECC is the obligation for RECCo to consult on its budget. This is to allow parties and RECC parties the opportunity to scrutinise the budget, challenge the budget, and also appeal the budget, certain budget line items to Ofgem. The criteria for appeals are set out in the RECC, and any appeals must be made by the 7th of March 2023. Like most companies, and particularly I think companies in the energy industry at the moment, RECCo is continuing to operate in a challenging and changing environment. I think that's the new normal for at least a number of years. Our budget reflects the resources that we need to deliver the RECC services, which in turn enable the RECC parties to meet their regulatory obligations. The budget also allows us the resources to meet the challenges presented by the changing environment, and that is through our transformation programme. Alongside that, RECCo, whilst we are a non-profit making organisation, we are a limited liability company and we have all the obligations associated with such, We have to deliver all our legal compliance, our corporate governance compliance and risk management obligations. We absolutely recognise that the budget costs for the coming year are higher than originally expected, and we will talk and discuss the factors that contribute to that in the subsequent slides. I would highlight that 90% of the cost is due to two particular factors, and we will talk in some detail about those. Next slide, please. This slide addresses what actions have we taken to reduce costs from those published in the forward work plan in the middle of January to those now being published in the proposed budget for the coming year. As Elizabeth highlighted, and as highlighted, I think you get the flavour of the view is that we adopt commercial principles in the operation of the company. That particularly extends to procurement activities. Where the opportunity allows for competitive procurement, we will always do competitive procurement. We believe that that delivers best value for RECCo and in turn delivers best value for the REC parties. Where we have inherited services, for example, those services which we took on as a result of CSS Go Live, then we don't just accept those. We engage directly with the service providers and we engage with those service providers to make sure the RECCo is receiving best value from those services. In the forward work plan, when we published it in January, we identified work currently underway to reduce the impact of the unforeseen cost increases. And now I'm just going to talk about what has been achieved in the last month. Through positive engagement, and Elizabeth spoke earlier about how we have developed our working methodology and our engagement with our service providers over the last year. We've engaged directly with DCC, and as a result, we have reduced the CSS cost by 2.5 million. Alongside that, we have also agreed new ways of working with DCC, which will allow RECCo greater insight and understanding about the costs of the service are constructed. We've also engaged directly with the gas inquiry service provider, and as a result of that, we have reduced the cost of the service by circa £1 million per annum. We've also agreed a simplified charging structure, which in turn will lead to efficiencies within RECCo itself. What we also done was we looked at our own costs, and in particular, we revisited our transformation program for the coming year. And as a result of refocusing that, we have been able to reduce the expenditure by 1.1 million. All these reductions are reflected within the budget that's presented to you at the moment. What I would also like to highlight is that what's also included in the budget are the reductions on the Green Deal arrangements, which will kick in from April of this year. And we achieved those through dialogue with the Green Deal central charging service provider in 2022. I think it's very important that we publicly recognise and thank our service providers, DCC, Exoserve, and Exoserve's key subcontractor Corella, and CNC Group for the positive and professional manner of their engagement in our discussions over the last month and subsequently back in 2022. Excuse me, I've got a bit of a tickly throat at the moment. Next slide, please. So this slide provides a budget overview of our costs for the coming year. We're very cognizant of the fact that with our REC service providers, all bar one of those are commercial businesses. And consequently, we have confidentiality obligations within our contracts with them, and therefore we do not we're unable to provide a level of detail which would identify any individual contract values because we do not want to breach our contractual confidentiality obligations. The budget for 23-24 is just over 50 million, 50.5 million. The budget was always expected to increase compared to the current budget for RECCo for 2022-23, which is about 30 million. But nonetheless, and that reflects the fact that from the 1st of April, we take on the liability for the CSS charges. And also we have the full year impact in 23-24 of services, enhanced services that went live last year, namely the electricity inquiry service and the gas inquiry service at the same time as CSS goes live. However, the budget is 8 million more than we expected, and we're open and transparent to show that what we expected for the coming year was circa 42 million, and now we're showing 50.5 million. So there's an 8 million pound increase, and it's incumbent on us to explain why that is. 90% of the increase is due to CSS costs being higher than were originally envisaged, which we based on those published by DCC in their 2021 business plan. Pete spoke about the increased obligations, scope and responsibilities on RECCo as a result of the changes in the MHHS project, and those in turn have shifted some costs into the RECCo budget. Together, those movements from what we expected account for circa 90% of the overall increase. The balance, 10% of the increase, is reflecting increase in RECCo's operational costs, and also a deferral of some costs from 22-23 into this coming year. We are cognizant that we are spending industry and consumers' money, and as a result, we absolutely have an obligation to deliver economic, efficient, secure, scalable and adaptable services. And within services, that is across the board within RECCo. That is not just direct services, but the same obligations apply to us with any of our operating and internal costs. As I noted earlier, we have already taken action to reduce costs, and we will continue to do so throughout the year. We will continue to manage our costs in a prudent way. And I believe that our track record demonstrates that we do this, both in terms of the initial reductions that we have achieved in the last month, but also through the return of rebates in prior years. Talking of rebates, we expect to underspend against the 22-23 budget. The value of that rebate will be determined through the audit of our financial statements, but our expectation is, based on our latest forecasts, and considering we're only a month away from the year end, we would expect that rebate will offset a material element of the unforeseen £8 million cost increase for next year. Next slide, please. This slide is very much a factual slide. It provides a detail and a breakdown of how the overall budget is broken down into our charges, and also the mechanism of recovery that RECCo will apply. Historically, we used to phase our charges on a quarterly basis, reflecting seasonality of cost, and we got feedback, I think 2 years ago, that said, no, actually industry likes the predictability of the costs over each quarter, therefore can you phase the costs evenly over the year? We will do that. We will phase our costs evenly over the year, and we will recover them evenly over four quarters. We will take on the obligation to manage cost seasonality, and we will manage our cash flows and working capital accordingly. Charges will be invoiced in the first month of each calendar quarter. We committed to separating out the MHHS charges, and we will show them separately on invoices. As noted in the forward work plan, this separation will allow parties the opportunity to consider if those costs could be capitalised internally within your business as an intangible asset under International Accounting Standard 38, rather than having to take those to your income and expenditure profit and loss accounts for the coming year. We will continue to invoice non-REC parties, for example, TPIs, for the user pay services, and we will also proactively implement credit control procedures, not just in respect of RECCo's, not just in respect of those invoices raised and issued for REC charges, but also for those invoices issued and raised in respect of MSC charges, and also the invoice raised and issued in respect of the theft deduction incentive scheme. In 22-23, we expect our bad debts to be less than £10,000 compared to the budget of 30 million, and that's primarily driven by some market failures during the year. Next slide, please. As I mentioned earlier, we're very cognizant we have to maintain commercial confidentiality, and therefore we don't break the cost down on a contract by contract basis. The RECC services, Elizabeth provided quite a lot of detail on those, so I'm not going to recover that ground. These are the contracted outsourced services that RECCo has. They're a blend of competitively procured services and also inherited services. They are provided to support RECC parties in discharging their regulatory obligations, delivering their business processes, etc. What we have done over the last couple of years is that we have placed fixed price initial term contracts, and in hindsight, that has allowed us to mitigate the inflationary impacts that we're all experiencing at the moment. As Elizabeth said, we hold our service providers to account for their service performance. We pay them to deliver a service, we expect them to deliver the service, and in the event that they don't deliver the service, then we implement our those things under the contract where we can recover liquidated damages. And as we've highlighted in some of our correspondences, we recovered circa 900,000 in liquidated damages, delay payment service credits, whichever nomenclature you wish to use in 2022. Financial change for 23-24 compared to the current year is that RECCo will have responsibility for CSS costs from the 1st of April. When you look at those two columns, that's the key differentiator between, if you looked at what RECCo's current obligations are in this current financial year to next year, the introduction of CSS is the big one. The budget as set out at the moment reflects the cost reductions achieved on CSS, GES and Green Deal. What we would like to know that for the CSS costs, they're an expectation of the costs to be incurred in the coming year. It's the budget as set out for the coming year, but any cost must be incurred by DCC in accordance with its license obligations, and any costs incurred will be subject to the normal ex post, I think if that's the right phrase, review by Ofgem at the end of the year as an assessment of DCC's overall costs. As Elizabeth identified, the scale, scope, nature of RECC services and the RECC service providers play a key role in defining RECCo's operational capacity and capability requirements going forward. I need to pause there to allow people to sort of submit any questions onto the chat before we move on to the next slide. Okay, can we have the next slide, please? So RECCo operations. So these are the overall costs associated with the operation of RECCo. RECCo, the company is structured, it has a recognisable corporate and operational structure. We have functions within the organisation and we have an independent board of directors. We adopt a commercial approach to the operation of the company. The full suite of RECC services are now live, as Elizabeth said, and they play a key role in defining what our capability and capacity requirements are. Increasingly, we're moving towards technology and data management services as a greater element of the obligations on RECCo for the delivery of services. Whilst the code manager is still code manager services will absolutely continue to be the personal touch points between RECC parties and RECCo, the use of systems and services is increasing. What that means is for RECCo that we are requiring to have a different capability profile than say within some of the historic codes that RECCo took over. We now know what the current ask is for the company. What is RECCo required to deliver right now, as Elizabeth described it as BAU plus. We also know are the challenges faced for the future, and we have right-sized the organisation to meet those. Not doing so, not meeting the current ask and preparing for the future ask would compromise our ability to deliver the RECC objectives, the RECCo objectives, the RECC services, and also our ability to meet our financial liabilities. We've right-sized the organisation to ensure that we can develop and deliver the strategy and policy that John talked about. Use a slightly provocative phrase that we can man-mark our RECCo service providers and also man-mark our REC service areas, that we can deliver our transformation program, and that we can also engage with stakeholders. And then, as I said, we're a limited company, and of course, we've got all those very exciting commercial, financial, corporate governance and risk management obligations that we also need to comply with. Our operating costs are just less than 10% of our overall budget. Again, let people the opportunity to submit any questions. And in particular, I draw people's particular attention, sorry, it's gone, but the comment there regarding that RECCo needs to be an expert organisation. We're dealing with complex matters, and we have to have the right people in the right jobs doing the right thing to make sure that best value is achieved. So the next slide, please. In this particular slide, we have categorized the budget for the programs in size of expenditure. So it goes, there's 4 key financially significant programs for 23-24. There's MHHS, data and digitalization, theft reduction, and the REC services evolution. I'm not going to repeat kind of the information provided by Pete and Elizabeth on those. What I would say is that we have reduced the budget expenditure by circa 1.1 million from our expectation published in January. Pete and Elizabeth has outlined the detail of each of those programs, but nonetheless, our program costs for the coming year are circa 3.7 million higher than expected. And there are 3 key drivers for this. Of that 3.7 million increase higher than we were expected, 2.5 million is on MHHS, and that reflects the increased obligations, responsibilities on RECCo greater than those we were originally expecting this time 12 months ago. What we've also included is an allowance of circa 700,000 for REC services evolution. And Elizabeth spoke earlier about what that would be. The focus is on the code manager evolution, services evolution, and also on the inquiry services evolution. This was not included in our original budget expectation for 23-24. At the time of preparation, which is roughly 12 months ago, code manager services were live for just 6 months. The EES service was not live. In fact, we hadn't signed a contract for the new EES service. We were in the process of discussing and negotiating and agreeing that contract, and we had just commenced discussions on the gas inquiry service contract. We therefore could not make an informed assessment, I would say even a reasonable assessment, of what our procurement plans would be for these 3 key services. We roll on 12 months to where we are right now, and we are absolutely in a position to do so. What we have included is the first stages in the ultimate procurement project for these services, and Elizabeth provided the detail around that. Our data and theft programs also are higher than expected for the coming year, and that reflects essentially the transference of about 1.3 million from what we included in 22-23 into 23-24. And also, as Peter identified, there are 2 projects, 2 projects within the data program, which are binary. If they don't happen, those costs won't be incurred. You'll also note that MSC project costs have dropped off. We were expecting 500,000 for the coming year. The services and contracts that we put in place last year when we mobilized and delivered the MSC project in sort of the first half of 2022, they were delivered at less than our expectation was for last year, but also the enduring costs are non-material, and they primarily relate to data extraction information from existing industry data sets, and the costs of doing so we have included within our REC service charges line where appropriate. Again, I'll give people the opportunity to submit any questions. So if we can move on to the last slide, please. So change in contingency. the RECC is an evolving document. The RECC services are evolving services, and the industry and the energy industry as in its total is an evolving industry as well. We think it's very important that we identify the change allowance separately and do not disaggregate and include it within individual budget allowances. Therefore, we show it separately within our budget for the coming year. We've maintained the change allowance at the expected value. It is higher than the current financial year change allowance, and that reflects the fact that we take on financial obligation for any CSS related changes from April 2023. Any changes up to 31st of March, they will be funded through the RECCo arrangements. And also we will have the full year life experience of the ES and GES. The change allowance is used to fund the cost of changes to RECC services. I think it's important to understand that the code manager contracts already include the cost of managing change. That's part of their service. That's part of what we pay them to do. For any changes, regardless of where those changes originate, whether they originate through the RECC change process or they originate through internal RECCo processes, they go through a structured assessment process. That assessment is to ensure that, one, what we're procuring is needed, and goes without saying. Two, that what's been offered by the service provider is what we're asking for. And then as regards to financial elements, that the costs that are being proposed are economic, efficient, and affordable within our budget. What we also show separately for transparency is a contingency allowance that we include within the budget. Individual budget lines do not include contingency. We don't pack each budget line with an element of contingency and then have an overall budget contingency as well. The only area that we have included a specific project contingency for 23-24 is within MHHS, and that is reflective of the fact that our projects and our programs form part of a broader industry program. They have a broad range of impacts on the company, and it comes out of MHHS, be it systems impact, RECC impacts, be it on the inquiry services or CSS services, and therefore we feel it is prudent to include a specific project contingency therein. We have maintained the contingency at the expected level, and the contingency represents slightly less than 4% of our total budget. So again, I'll give people the opportunity to submit any questions, but I think that that's the last slide from me. Yes. So now I'll come off camera.
Thank you, Brian, and thank you everyone for your attention and for submitting the questions. We've had a few come in. So the first question I'm going to pose, and actually Brian, all of the ones that have come in, I'm going to ask you to handle. So perhaps if you come back onto camera, we can just run through these in turn. So the first question is a process one, which is, if we have challenges about the numbers in the budget, how should we raise them?
Okay, so I think there's two routes for this. So if there is particular information that somebody wants on a particular budget line, and I will say that the extent of us sharing the information will always be caveated around that we will not breach commercial confidentiality of contracts. So kind of if somebody says, how much are you paying, the RPS, or how much are you paying XSR for the gas inquiry service, we can't breach that. That we would be instantly in contract breach, so we won't be able to do it. But if there is questions, general questions around constructs of budgets, rationale, etc., please submit them to me. I think actually on the next slide we say that. Then for a formal appeal against, and I would absolutely point people to the criteria and the process, and we have paraphrased it to some degree within the budget documentation itself, what the RECC says about submitting appeals to Ofgem. So if there is a formal appeal to Ofgem, then that has to be done by the 7th of March. But in the first instance, if somebody said is, you know, somebody wants an explanation of what's this cost or a bit more information here or there, is please submit it direct. You can submit it direct to myself, and I think we've included that in the next slide, and I think we've also included in the budget documentation my email address. I'm just reading the chat.
Yeah, Brian, the next question I wanted to ask, actually, there's a couple of things in it actually. So it was, are the numbers in the document the final budget? And the question phrases already signed off by the RECC panel, so we should probably clarify kind of who's actually signed off the budget, because the terminology is slightly different. Or is this a draft budget?
So so the budget has been approved by the RECC board, and so just have been really pedantic now is that there isn't a RECC panel. There's a RECC board, and the RECC board is essentially the board of directors of the corporate entity. They have approved the budget, and the budget has been approved subject to consultation to industry. So if we kind of think of two scenarios. So there's no appeals made, then it's essentially the final budget. If there's an appeal made and the appeal is submitted to Ofgem, and there's a process within the RECC as to what Ofgem does, and they'll come and ask us questions, etc., and the appeal process goes through, and let's say the appeal process is upheld, and Ofgem says you're not incurring that cost for whatever reason, then essentially it's in the event that there's appeal made, it's ultimately, I would say, Ofgem have the right to approve the budget. But this budget is the proposed budget for next year. It has been approved by the RECC board, and it is subject to the consultation outcome.
Thanks, Brian. And one more process.
And I'm just reading the question is, and then I think at the end it says, the last slide on the January webinar said the forward work plan should close on the 3rd of February. That has happened, but there will be a separate consultation on the 23 budget. Is this what we are in now? Yes, this is the formal consultation on the 23-24 budget.
Cool. Thanks, Brian. That was the last bit that I was going to ask you to clarify.
Oh, sorry.
No, that's all good. The next question is related to the mechanisms, which is, what's the rationale for charging suppliers on an RMP basis?
The rationale is that that's what's set out in the RECC. That's what was originally defined, and RMP, and I keep getting this wrong, the definition is, I always call it registered meter point. It's not, it's registered measurement point. And on the rationale that was set out when the RECC was developed is that the RECC is ultimately for the benefit of suppliers. Consequently, it is charged to suppliers, and in very simplistic terms, it's proportional to market share based on numbers of registered measurement points as reported across the impact. Oh no, impasse doesn't exist anymore, across the registration systems, both in gas and electricity. I would say that there is also a carryover. There is a small element. So on the slide which shows the charges, there is a carry across and a maintenance of an exemption of charges, which was where distribution businesses in the electricity market fund an element of the electricity inquiry services. So those costs are essentially, they're separated out first. They're calculated based on size of distribution business as 750,000 RMPs on their registration systems, and the big ones get charged a kind of a fixed value, and the ones less than they get charged based on I'll call it market share as well, based on registered meter points.
Thanks, Brian. I've got one more question to ask. Before I do that, I just wanted to draw everyone's attention to a note that Jenny has popped into the chat of this webinar, which is just asking if you're able to provide us some feedback in terms of this webinar. We've got a short survey, so please, if you're able to, do complete that. And then also some information regarding Brian's contact details and the appeals process to Ofgem, which is also on the final slide that I'll come on to after this question. So the last question for you, Brian, is who procures services for RECCo? Is it an internal team, or do we outsource that?
Historically, It was so the very first services that were procured for RECCo were the code manager services, and at the point RECCo was, I'll use a terrible phrase, but it was a shell organisation. It had a board of directors, an interim board of directors, which were constituted by Ofgem. And during that period of time, there was RECCo didn't have any employees. It had contractors in place to support its operations, and those services were procured using a combination of SMEs and expert procurement advice, because we were subject to public contracting regulations at that point in time. Subsequent to that, sorry, get rid of the cat. Subsequent to that, we have created a financial and commercial capability within the company, and now services are procured through through internal resource with appropriate legal resource, because you always need to go to the lawyers to make sure the contract is compliant.
Great, thank you for that, Brian. So I don't have any further questions that have arisen during this Q&A session. So that just leads me to just run through the next steps, which I think have been mentioned already this morning. But hopefully, if you haven't already seen the budget document, you can find it either on our website and also via the chat function of this meeting. Brian's email address is there for any direct feedback or discussions around further detail on the budget. So please do get in touch and email Brian if there are any queries or points you just want to understand in a bit more detail. As previously mentioned, the consultation period closes on the 7th of March, and as Brian set out, that is the deadline to which an appeal would need to be made to Ofgem should you choose to do so. And as I previously mentioned, we do have a feedback survey for the webinar up in the chat, so please do provide us with some feedback, because like everybody, we always like to try and improve what we're doing as much as possible, and to make sure that the communications that we're giving about important topics to REC parties are as well thought through and as appropriate as they can be. So please do that if you have the time. So that just leads me to close the webinar this morning, and thank everybody for attending, and please do be in touch about the budget should you have any further questions to do so. So I'm going to close the recording now and give everybody some time back in their diaries, and thank you very much for attending.
Thank you very much. Have a lovely day.